welcome to another edition of the Mayor Dan Paletko Show. I'm very pleased to have as my guest today our own State Senator David Knezek. And Dave is a local boy doing well in the legislature. We're proud of you, and thank you for being a guest on the Dan Paletko Show.
It's my pleasure to be here, Mayor. Thank you.
Now, background-wise, you're a local product of Dearborn Heights, aren't you?
Yeah, so my whole family is from the area. My dad's actually a retired police officer here for the city. He served 24 years with the police department. My mom was a lunch lady at Crestwood High School when I was a student there. And my brother and sister and I both started at St. Linus, ended up going to Crestwood Public Schools, and so I graduated from Crestwood High School back in 2004. Left, obviously, for the military, but came back, and I think I'm only half-mile up the road from where I was born and raised, so I'm right at Beach Daily Ann Arbor Trail, really easy to find. And
we're really pleased to have you as our state senator. One of the keys is there's a lot of communities, a lot of counties. I think there's 82 of them, but there's only 38 senators.
Sure.
So everybody would love to have their state senator come from their community, and we have the opportunity that we have that situation. And why I think it's important is you know our issues, you can relate and help us in those legislative matters, being so familiar.
Yeah, and I think one of the other cool things, even cooler with Dearborn Heights, is that not only do we have the state senator from Dearborn Heights, we also have the state representative.
Yes.
And who knows, by the end of the year we might have a Supreme Court justice too.
That's a possibility, although in this community there's actually this would be the third one.
Right.
And so I keep telling people, if you want to be a Supreme Court justice in Michigan, you needed to have grown up in the south end of Dearborn Heights, because they're all kind of bunched in a general area. So it's been really a great thing, although Plawecki grew up in the north end, but the other two were from the south end. So.
Sure. Well, and too, like you said, being from the community, you know the people. It's easy for folks to just pick up the phone and give you a call directly. No one's going to the office or trying to check in with staff or what have you. You're from here. You know the folks. You know what the issues are. But at the same time, I always try to find ways to get back out in the community and reconnect with folks. Because even though I have my own personal set of experiences of growing up here in Dearborn Heights, there's tens of thousands of other people who have different experiences, and so just an example, I was at Bedford Elementary this morning in the South End, just talking with some kids about kind of what they're seeing, what they're thinking in the South End of the Heights, and so. For me, I'm just one person. Like I said, there's tens of thousands of other people out there that, they want their issues brought to light, and they need to have someone who's fighting on their behalf. So I like to maintain those relationships in the community too.
And you do a good job at that.
Appreciate it.
One of the unique things that you've been able to do is, and I had the opportunity and the privilege of serving in the House of Representatives, which you did, but now. Although when the House members, we always felt we were the upper house, but you are in the Senate.
Sure.
What are the pros and cons? What's the differences from being in one legislative body versus the other?
The House of Representatives is a little bit more fast-paced, a little bit more hectic. You've got 110 people all moving around on the House floor at the same time. And if you put up an issue for a vote, as you know, the board could be open for 5 minutes, the board could be open for 5 hours to take that vote. So it gives you an opportunity to go around, get to know people, and to understand, even if you disagree with what their perspective is, you get an understanding of why they're bringing that to the table, or what helped shape, that belief system. When I first got to the Senate, it's an entirely different animal. Every vote only has 60 seconds. If you miss the 60 seconds, you miss the vote. And so that opportunity really to network on the floor with individuals is completely gone.
Wow.
And so for me, it's just been a challenge to really try and find times outside of the legislature to build those relationships and to get those bonds strengthened with other members of the legislature. And I would share that, personally, you go from being one of 110 to being one of 38. And so it's a bit easier to maneuver legislatively. I've found it to be more rewarding and more beneficial, especially for the constituents. When you're one of 38 people, being able to sort of push and advocate for different issues up there is easier for them to get raised to a level that you want them to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I often wondered if anybody could have a microphone and listen to what we talk to, because there is a lot of downtime, if you will. I mean, there's times that you're on the floor, but they might be trying to get enough votes for an issue, and so you're sitting around and you might have had other thoughts. So maybe you catch up on some constituent calls or letters and things of that sort. But that always, I found that intriguing, that, like you say, walk around and talk to some of the other members, and where there might have been an issue where I was on the finance, the budget. One of the items that was of great concern to me was the drain code, and there was a representative, Ypsilanti, on the Democratic side who was working on that, and I learned so much of what the drain code was all about, and it was the first time they were trying to reform it since 1950 or 51, and there was a Republican and a Democrat that were determined to get it. They both got left the legislature, did not make the reform, but I remember she would show me, and it was about, that legislation was about that thick, and you learn those kinds of things, and you could have that correspondence discussion, which was invaluable.
Well, I think one of the downsides, and you really just kind of hit on it, is that term limits piece, where you've got individuals who are working for 6 years to get something done, and they hit that limit, and then they're out the door, and it goes right back to square one. And as folks know, I'm a Democrat. I'm in the minority in the Senate. We're in a minority in the House. Administratively, you have to have those relationships on other sides of the aisle if you want to be able to get anything done. And so, like I said, it's really important that you sort of take yourself outside of that bubble. I know there's people in Lansing, they sit on their side of the aisle, the Democratic side or the Republican side, and they refuse to cross over and talk to anybody. Well, you're going to do a really good job at doing nothing for your 6 or 8 years that you're in Lansing. And so you realize, and you see it in the votes, and you know this, where 95% of the things that we do, we all agree on. It's that 5% of the really hot button issues that get all the press and result in sort of that rancor up in Lansing. You have to be willing to work across the aisle if you want to get something done, particularly in the minority. And so that's something that I've never really shied away from, and has been incredibly rewarding at the same time.
One thing I'll share with the audience, in the Michigan Association of CPAs, we had Skubik, who, I don't know if they told you the same thing. When I came up to Lansing, he said, don't talk to Skubik. He used to like to go around to new members, rookies, if you will, and say, oh, when are you running for governor? And trick you and those kinds of things. But Skubik was our guest speaker, and they were all CPAs, and mainly people who had practiced for many years. A lot of them had their own firms or were in large national firms. And Skubik just asked a question, how many were for term limits? And I'd say 80% of the hands went up. Mine did not, but 80%. And then he called on me, we had a little bit of discussion, and then he told the audience, he picked a guy random, and he said, are you a better accountant now, or were you a better accountant 25 years ago when you first started, guessing on his age? The man said, well, you gotta be ridiculous, Mr. Skubik. I know my profession now, in and out. I'm a really good accountant. I was just a young kid with 2 years.
Right.
It took me 10, 15 years to learn my job. And Skubik said, well, don't you think a legislator is in the same position? And he made the story and the observation of great leaders in Michigan and the legislature. He mentioned Ryan, he mentioned others who, because they had been there for longer than 8 or 6 years or whatever they were there, were able to move the state of Michigan forward. And we've lost that. We've lost institutional knowledge. So Skubik took another vote after all this discussion, and it reversed itself. It was there were still about 30% of the people that no matter what, they were for term limits, but 70% changed their mind. And I never forgot that he said that. But let's get into a little bit of legislation, because there are things that you've been able to accomplish up there. There are issues that are going to be confronting you, but one, you've done a lot in past legislation that's helped our Michigan veterans.
Sure.
And can you describe some of the things you've been able to do?
So one of the things that I was really proud to get done, and it really was in not even the 11th hour, it was the 12th hour of my term in the House of Representatives. Since the Civil War, we've been able to give a hiring preference to veterans on the public side or on the public sector for our jobs. We haven't had the ability to do that in the private side. But we know, regardless of the business or who it is or who you're talking to, they want to hire veterans. But there was this gray area in the law. They weren't sure if they would be subject to any sort of legal action if they were to do that. And so one of the pieces of legislation we got when I was in the House was granting the ability for private employers to give a veterans hiring preference. And believe it or not, I was at a Memorial Day ceremony last year in Garden City, and this guy comes up to me. He says, "You're Knezek, huh?" I said, "Oh yeah, geez, I'm in trouble or something." He said, "I was the finalist for a job up in Farmington Hills to get to work with the city, and they told me at the end that they had this new ability to hire veterans and give veterans a preference, and so they gave me the job over this other guy that I was competing with. You know, we both had very comparable skills, but they wanted to help the veteran out." He says, "My wife told me that was your bill." I said, "It was." He says, "I just want to say thanks." And it's stuff like that. Even if it's only one story, Mayor, you feel like it's doing something to help out somebody in the process.
Absolutely. And to get any legislation passed, being in a minority is almost impossible. So that is really a great accomplishment. There's a couple pieces of legislation that I and my staff had worked on. But we were told by leadership, the only way you're going to get that passed is pick somebody on the Republican side to introduce it. So I used to go to Senator Toy and ask her out of Livonia. And so she and my office used to work real well together. So if you look in the legislation, it's Senator Toy but all the work and everything was done by ours. But that's how sometimes you have to, and you work both sides of the aisle. It's the only way to get things accomplished.
It's that phrase, you'd be surprised how much you can get done when you don't care who takes credit for it.
Yes.
And we had an issue over in Garden City with some dual roles that they were having individuals fill at the city. There was a question mark in the law. The Constitution was silent on it. Their city charter said they could do it. The state was kind of gray area. I had gotten the bill through the House and through a Senate hearing when I was in the House, couldn't get it across the finish line. We picked up the phone. We called Representative Heisey from out in Plymouth and said, "Kurt, can you run this, and can we work together to get it done?" And he was able to get it done a little bit faster than I was. And so you're absolutely right. And particularly on the veterans issues, it's good because being a veteran myself, folks on the other side of the aisle, they respect that. And they understand that it's an issue that you're passionate about because you've lived it. And so they're very willing to work with you. The other one that we got done earlier last year was for veterans who are coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury. A lot of them have a service animal that they use just to go about their day, be able to maintain some semblance of calm and order, if you will. Well, a lot of folks look at them and they say, "Well, you've got both your arms, you've got both your legs, you can see, you can hear. That's not a service dog, you don't really need it." And they're kicking the veterans out of the businesses. And so we underwent a massive rewrite of those laws, bringing Michigan into compliance with the ADA. We said it's a 4-bill package, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 2 House members, 2 Senate members. 3 of the 4 of us were veterans, and the 4th was the chairwoman of the Veterans Committee. So it was all right in our wheelhouse, and that was something we were able to get done in 6 months. And so, like you said, it's really about moving the ball forward. If you can't do it yourself, you need to be humble enough to say, who can I engage to help me with this process? And then hope that you can get it done in the 6 or 8 years that you're there, or find somebody to pass that ball off to when your time is up.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's a lot of similarities, but for instance, Richard Young, who was a state representative for years, and I remember talking to him, and in his era, many of them used to room near each other, so they got to know one another. Back in the day, he used to tell me we'd all have a cigar and play cards, and we got to be good friends. And it doesn't happen nowadays. You don't have that closeness, and it becomes hard to make that outreach. I get in well with the Speaker of the House, Johnson, simply because I'm a big NASCAR fan, and he was, and I ran into him at Michigan International Speedway, and right away, after he saw me out there, it was like he would come and we'd talk races a little bit, but gave me the opportunity. And leadership is so important. When you're trying to get legislation moved, there's no one to have better in the House than the Speaker. And I'm sure it's the same way with the leadership in the Senate. I want to ask you a question. We've had a governor who has come under a lot of attack in regards to the Flint, and I want to compliment you on your efforts to get water for the people of Flint. I thought that was a great humanitarian, and I was happy to do a very small part, but a lot of kudos to you for putting that together. Some of us in the Michigan Municipal League have had the opportunity to kind of grab the governor's ear and say, you know, for schools, for municipalities, we're hurting. We need to have state shared revenues increase. And the governor, for the first time in the last few months, has kind of been receptive of that. But is the governor able to be an important instrument now in Lansing in light of how much the Flint crisis has hurt him?
Well, so, you know, first I'll talk about, you know, the fact that, you know, we should all be thankful that the governor's willing to admit that this funding issue, you know, is a big problem. And I tell folks, you know, as we go through the budget process, if you look at what each school is going to get this year in terms of an increase, well, that looks great on the surface. And if you look at the municipalities and, you know, the increase that they're going to get this year, well, that looks great on the surface. But what we forget is, in the beginning of the administration, and really for some time now, the support, state shared revenue for our local municipalities and our school districts was cut so drastically. What we're getting back now is really just a drop in the bucket. And so, you know, the analogy that I use with folks is that, you know, we came in and we dug folks a 10-foot hole, and now we're giving you a 6-foot ladder. So you're not quite out of it yet. We're trying to make you feel like you're getting there. But, you know, I give credit to the governor for at least acknowledging that, you know, we're in that situation. From a governing perspective, Mayor, there's no doubt. You know, the situations that have been going on in Flint, with Detroit Public Schools now, the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans, this governor has not had a very good 2016 to date. And so that makes it difficult to sort of leverage, you know, the power that comes with being governor. Folks don't want to touch it. Folks don't want to hear what he has to say, and they just as soon write him off as include him in that process. And when you look at the House of Representatives, for example, where you have an incredibly fractured and divided House of Representatives, it makes it even more difficult. So, you know, I had a conversation this morning with John Fazer, the superintendent from D7 in the South End, and we're talking about, you know, the Senate, you guys can come together and you can get it done and you can be bipartisan and kick out a plan for Detroit Public Schools in this case. And then it goes to the House of Representatives and it just gets completely mangled. And so that is the type of stuff that drives the conversations that we hear in the community about people being frustrated with their government. They don't see some of the good that's being done. They don't see some of the actions that's being taken. They see the dysfunction. They see the hyper-partisanship. They see the refusal to put aside whatever personal issues they may have to work on something that actually moves the state or moves the community forward. It is, to give you a very direct answer, it's far more difficult now, given some of the tragedies that we've had this year, than it's ever been in years past.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of public appearances. I used to run into him at the, his seats were right on the floor, but the Michigan basketball home games, and we have not seen him. I'm going to say around November he stopped coming.
Right.
And then there's been a couple more events that I've been at that in years past he's been there and given us an opportunity, but we've just not been able to have much discussions with him. He's been pretty much, and I don't think any of the Republican presidential candidates wanted to be seen with him.
Absolutely.
And so that makes it very difficult to operate as the party leader in the state. One of the things that people are starting to notice and is that at one time we went through a whole bunch of discussion and then a road package got passed.
Oh my.
And I have people who come to me and say, we're doing some road repair on Monroe, on Hass, and they go, what about my street? And I go, you know, you won't believe this, but I said all that money that's supposed to come in isn't planned on hitting anybody till about 2019, 2020.
Right.
So I actually have the same or less money in local and major streets and like all the other communities. So that's why the roads aren't getting repaired.
So I love getting this question, and you really hit the first piece, you know, on the head. This is again the problem when you have a legislature that's seeking out a headline instead of an actual solution. And so you'll see all across the state now folks saying, well, we passed a roads package and we took action and we heard you, residents of Michigan, we got the roads done. Well, the devil's always in the details. Mm-hmm. And you know, you talked about the plan not really kicking in until 2019, 2020. The plan won't be fully implemented until 2021, when, as you'll note, almost everybody that passed that plan in the House is long gone, yeah. Kicking the can down the now even more damaged road. And so that was problem number one. It's not on a sufficient timeline. Problem number two, the $1.2 billion that they were coming up with, $600 million of it was coming from new taxes, $600 million of it was coming from general fund cuts. And so if you look at the taxes piece, every time you go to renew that registration, you're going to be reminded of what the Michigan legislature did in order to come up with that money to fix the roads. And then you're going to go out and look at the roads and say, well, where's the fix? Yeah. And that $600 million in general fund cuts, these are just blind cuts. We have no clue where in the budget that money is going to come from. We're not going to know until we go through the budget process over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so to me, that's incredibly dangerous when you think about the cuts that could come to education, seniors, veterans, you name it. And like you said, you look around at the roads and folks are wondering, well, where's the fix? I thought we passed the money. I thought this was a done issue. Number one, it's not really done. And number two, I don't believe that the amount of money that they passed was sufficient either. When the conversation started, we were looking at maybe $1 billion in a fix. As months went by, the price tag gets higher. Nobody adjusted that price tag as we went 1, 2, 3 years into the conversation. I think we're going to be $1 to $2 billion short when it comes to maintaining those roads. Because mind you, it's not to get them to great, it's to get them to sufficient. Yeah. And it's only a select number of roads. And the other piece is, not to drag on too long, they've got this other piece of the puzzle with the roads, segments of the money that are being put into what's called a 50-year lockbox. It's just a pot of money that can't be touched unless the majorities in the Senate and the House pass a resolution saying that you can touch it. Well, what that turns into is whatever party is in control at the time, well, you've got a nice couple $100 million slush fund to give out whatever personal projects you want for the roads. And I think of working with Bill Zimmer here in the city. Whenever we get asked to submit projects to get done, we reach out to Bill, or you reach out to Wade Trim, what's next on the list. And you submit the projects for approval from what we call the Roads and Risks Reserve Fund. Mm-hmm. They might approve 100 projects. 97 of the projects are in Republican districts. 3 of the projects are in Democratic districts. Again, that's just not the right way to run government. If you've got road money, send it all through the formula, make sure everybody gets it distributed equally and on an as-need basis, not just based upon what political party you're in.
And that's one of the reasons that yourself, our 2 representatives that service Dearborn Heights, really aren't to be blamed, because you were trying to get an effective road bill passed, and it just was not to be. The power party was not agreeable to putting that effort into it. But that's I had an opportunity recently with other mayors to meet with Congressman or Congresswoman Dingell, and she went around the table and said, what do you think is the most major difficult that Congress in Washington needs to deal with? But it's the same issue whether you're at the national or local level. I think it's our infrastructure. We've
Sure.
allowed the water, the sewer lines, the roads, the bridges, all the kind of crumble. And then when I look at the buildings in public schools in Detroit, that's another. But the infrastructure, I don't know what the solution is. I remember my uncle always talking about being a member of the, I think they called them WPA, but they just grabbed a lot of unemployed people during the Roosevelt era and had them build roads, had them build bridges, put people to work, revitalize the economy. It was a real boost, and everybody profited from that. At the same time, we got an infrastructure, but I've heard people, even when we've in other communities, told me that, well, those lines were built by WPA in such a year, the bridge, and it's like things weren't meant to last 200-300 years.
Right. The infrastructure piece is huge, and this year in the budget, I sit on appropriations the same way that you did. There was $163 million, I believe, was the number that they've allocated to sort of start up this infrastructure fund, if you will. Now, having run the city for so long, $163 million isn't going to get very many cities very far at all. And so, again, it's us having to take a step back and ask ourselves, what do we value in this state? What do we want to make investments in? And to then be forthright with ourselves to say, some of that's going to take money, and that money has to come from somewhere. Are we going to get money by giving away massive tax breaks to folks? Are we going to have adequate revenue when we talk about everybody paying their fair share in this state? Me personally, I don't think that's the system that we have right now, and we continue to get ourselves into situations like we had last week, where we hear not only is the budget projection going to be a little bit short this year, we're going to be hundreds of millions of dollars short of what we projected. That's hundreds of millions of dollars that aren't going to the roads, that aren't going to the schools, that aren't going to our local municipalities to provide the services that all of us want and frankly deserve as residents of whatever city it is that we live in. So, we're in a tough situation right now, and simply saying we're going to talking about it's not enough. You got to be able to take some sort of actionable or make some sort of action on it, and we've just been very, very slow over the past few years to do that.
Well, our time has run so quickly. I got to have you back as a guest. We only got to talk on a couple of subjects, but thank you for doing the great job that you do as our state senator. Keep up the good work, and our senator is very accessible. So if you need to get a hold of him, I'm sure they can put on the bottom ways to contact you, but you'll find it's very personable, and he returns calls and letters and does all the kinds of things to make him a great senator. And so if you need to have an issue on a state level, please call the senator. And Senator, thank you for being a guest on Mayor Dan Paletko Show. And I want to thank everybody out there for watching another edition of the Mayor Dan Paletko Show.